Now we're going to talk about the dawn of the revolution. Now, the first part of this slide talks about the National Assembly, but I'm going to go a little bit back. Now, if you remember, in the period of the 18th century, there's this economic boom that's happening throughout Europe. But as France got richer, this wealth is distributed more unevenly, not only in different social groups, but within different regions. So it didn't take place in agriculture. And now France is mostly agricultural at the time, but took place in trade and commerce. This creates a new group of people. Um, and then you have like this middle class that emerges, and you have this newfound wealth that's side by side with gut wrenching poverty, both in the cities and in the countries. So these bourgeois families aspire for privileged status and are buying their way into it with their using their commercial wealth. And the finance minister calls that assembly of notables. So the nobles were handpicked. They came, they look at the books, they're asked to increase taxes, and they reject the idea. But now everybody knows how bad that is. So France, at this period of time, has this high debt, it's paying this high interest rate, and now landlords are going to tax the peasants more and more. So Louis calls something called the Estates General. The Estates General is that ancient institution that I talked about. Um, and it is, he asked them to begin to develop a list of grievances, and that's where we left off on the last slide. Now, this was the first meeting of the Estates General in 175 years. So this is like an old institution that never been called, because when you call them and you ask for things as a king, you are going to have to give something in return. But Louis XVI right now, he's scrambling. The problem with the Estates General is he calls it, and this leads to tons of public debate. It leads to discussion. Got to remember the printing press at this point in time. There's pamphlets being distributed everywhere. People can read. So you're just opening up people the ability to complain. You see this happen all the time. So the third estate, all right, if you remember, are this bourgeoisie, workers, peasants. But anybody over the age of 25 could take part in this drawing up grievances, as long as you weren't an actor. I don't know why they were discriminated against, a servant, or bankrupt. So you had to have some type of financial status. So there were about 60,000 grievance lists. So people are just sitting there, complain. Now, the general idea of these three estates was that they wanted to have a change, but it wasn't as dramatic as things are going to turn out. Really, all they wanted was a constitutional monarchy. They just wanted a law written down to limit the powers of a king. So in May, Louis XVI takes the throne under a gold canopy. So we see he just makes horrible decisions. The clergy are to his right, and the noble are to his left. And way in the back is the third estate. Now, here's the problem with the three estates. The first estate gets a vote, the second estate gets a vote, and the third estate gets a vote. So what's going to happen is the first and second estate are always going to agree, and even though they make up a minority of the population, the majority of the population is going to be outvoted. But this is the way that things used to be, but this doesn't quite cut it in modern France. So this is just the background right there. So they're going to, when they get there, they're going to argue over this vote. Each estate at the period of time got a separate vote. But no one knew how Louis was going to run this, because that didn't seem like that made any sense anymore. So they present their list of grievances, and like the increased taxes, the persecution of religious minorities, if you remember the group, the Protestants, the Huguenots, aristocratic privileges and clerical privileges, just how inefficient government was and how government could just interfere with your life. Remember, you can go out, you're a peasant, and have to build roads in the middle of whenever, and just a legal system that just didn't make logical, reasonable sense in the time of the Enlightenment. Now, the third estate elected mostly middle-class people. So you got to remember, you got first, second, third estate. It's not peasants and city workers who are in this meeting, but that new money is ones representing the third estate, the bourgeoisie. So the king refuses to make a decision on how this voting process is going to work. This was typical of him. He just couldn't make a decision. This third estate, they lose patience. All right. They invite the other two estates to develop a national assembly, but they get locked out. Right. So on June 20th, they meet in an indoor tennis court, which every historian somehow makes fun of since the French are known bad athletes, which I thought they actually had a decent soccer team. But it's an indoor tennis court, and they take an oath. This is called the tennis court oath. And this oath is basically that these people will not leave until France has a new constitution. All right. Now, Louis has a couple choices. He could embrace it and be the king of the people. All right. He could send troops in and get rid of these people. All right. And try to keep this nobility in place. But, of course, he chooses to do nothing. So on June 23rd, the king proposes new reforms, but still insists on the voting of the three estates. All right. So the third estate forms that national assembly. All right. And they kind of felt like these bourgeoisie felt like they were representing all of France. Now, these are people who have been elected all throughout France to represent France. All right. And these are the people reading the enlightened ideas who were still taxed a lot, but not getting the privilege. And they were going to be the ones representing the poor. So they agree to take on the national debt as they feel like they are representing France. And you got to remember, they do have a lot of money. And they're going to take on tax collection. And this is when Louis locks them out. And they agree not to the tennis court, not to leave until they write a constitution. Now, some people of the first and second estates, priests and nobles alike, walk out on the king, including his cousin. And the king responds, finally, by calling troops to Versailles. Now, if you remember, Versailles is outside of Paris. This is what the castle that Louis built, or the palace that Louis built, because he, as a child, was part of a noble coup and had to leave Paris and never trusted the Parisians, which is probably smart. Even to this day, Paris has a very revolutionary atmosphere. So this third estate forms the National Assembly. All right. And the king keeps the three estates, one single vote for each one. And the delegates of the third estate agree by an overwhelming majority that they want to form this National Assembly. And this is the first act of revolution. Now remember, Louis responds by sending troops, an army of mercenaries, so they weren't even French people, they were Swiss guards, around Versailles. All right, on the last side we ended up with the storming of the Bastille. Now this is considered the beginning of the French Revolution. Now, my metaphor or comparison was just imagine New York people taking over the city of New York, electing their own mayor, and forming their own little mini community in New York City. Meanwhile, the president's in DC, and rumors start circulating throughout the rest of the United States. In France, you got to remember most of France is agricultural. Rumors of the Bastille begin to spread. Now, most people can read at this point. I've talked about you have the printing press. Such rumors as like nobles are hiring outlaws to terrorize presidents, or that nobles are hoarding grain. Now, if you remember, there's an agrarian crisis, so people can't eat, and grain was something that they paid in taxes. So nobles are holding on to these taxes. It's made worse because Louis's brother and cousin are fleeing. So they're basically saying that the poop is hitting the fan and they're leaving France. And people start to think that maybe they are going to try to gain an army and come back in and take over France, possibly with foreign armies. So all these rumors are spreading in the countryside, and people begin to arm themselves with pitchforks and other farm tools, axes, and they break into nobles' manor houses. Sometimes they just like destroy the legal papers that bound them to dues where they owed money to these nobles, and basically put them into some type of slavery since they owed all this money, or burn down the house, depending on how bad it was. Now, it's going to be different in different parts of France. Some peasants are going to have good relationships and get paid more and own land. Other peasants are not going to have any rights at all. So it's going to be different in different parts of France. So this is going to hurt some parts. Not to even think about the United States, how regionally we're just a little bit different. More and more nobles are going to start to flee France. We're going to call them émigrés. And there's going to be this great fear that starts spreading throughout France. Now think about the coronavirus, and a lot of people are worried of how Americans are going to react because Americans are so afraid. And when you're afraid, you don't act rationally. I mean, think about the people who were hoarding cases and cases of toilet paper. Like, does that even make sense? If the world is ending, is toilet paper going to be the thing that I'm needing? I'm pretty sure I could figure out a way to get by without toilet paper. But again, people are not going to act rationally. Now, the second part of this is actually in Paris itself. So Parisians are nervous. They're worried because while the king is hesitating of his support of feudalism, and in the meantime, the National Assembly declares the national rights of man and citizen, which we're going to talk a little bit about in the next section. And they liked the king, but they were just worried about like who's in his ear and who's telling him things because he's not the strongest personality. And they wanted him to be in Paris. All right, remember he's in Versailles at this period of time, so he's still in DC. So historically, the women of Paris would go to Versailles, would walk there, and they would bring the king gifts and the queen flowers, and they would get the king's ear and they would say, we're starving, because women went for food. So this is something that historically had happened in France. They were called fishwives. So because women in this period of time, as men were working in their house, would do the buying and selling. And so when things were not good, they would go to the king and ask for favors, and he would listen and offer homage back to, or they would offer him homage and he would give them stuff in return. It gave them an opportunity to kind of whisper in his ear. Now, in Paris, the National Guard was in charge of distributing grain. So the National Guard is kind of like, the Paris army, like local militia in a way. And they're in charge of keeping peace. And if you remember, Lafayette is the head of the National Guard. They too are worried that they're going to be attacked because they are part of this Paris commune in a way. And the regiment of Versailles, so like Louis is in Versailles, and he has his own regiment of non-Parisians. All right, it was like, I think, again, another Swiss Guard, had a party the night before where they trampled on the tricolor flag, which is what we talked about. So there's like that disrespect. So thousands of women assemble in the streets of Paris, armed with brooms, kitchen tools, and God knows what. They found some pikes. They had 2 cannons with no ammunition, and the numbers vary, but I think 6,000 to 8,000 women marched 12 miles. Now think about how far a 12-mile march is. It's crazy that this was common because I've walked 12 miles before and I'm freaking done at the end of it. But they marched 12 miles to Versailles in the rain, and they swarm into the National Assembly. All right, so remember, the National Assembly had been locked out. They're in a tennis court outside of the Palace of Versailles, and they cry for bread. So the king at this period of time is out hunting, and he's called back. Louis meets with the women. He promises grain and told the National Assembly that he would agree to the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Meanwhile, Lafayette's in Paris with the troops, and he's convinced by them to march to Versailles to follow with a group of civilians. So then you have this huge procession of troops led by Lafayette. And he meets with the king. And Lafayette is, he's leading this group of insurgents, but he's also in favor of the king, as we're going to see in the future. And he talks to the king and he convinces the king to come back to Paris. Now remember, they're worried about who's whispering in the king's ear, so they want the king back in Paris to serve the people. The king says that he needs to sleep on it, and then in the next morning, a royal guardsman shoots a boy, and the mob swarms the palace and kills 2 royal guardsmen, and Lafayette is able to restore order. He appears on the balcony with the royal family, and takes them back to Paris. Meanwhile, the people are marching back. There's two heads of the National Guardsmen on pike. It's crazy, crazy scene. At this point, the king's back in Paris. He's loved by the people right now. Right? Remember, the press doesn't like him, but the people like him. And he appears to be in the support of the people. But behind the scenes, he's like working to kind of undercut what's going on right now. So at this point, the royal family moves to the Palace of Tuileries, which he had not been lived in for a really long time, since Louis XIV. And the Paris people now have gained a little bit more of a role, all right? And but it's not enough. So there's going to be a division. There's going to be these extreme patriots that are going to be part of Paris, which are going to be called the Jacobins, all right? And then there's going to be the moderates, which at this point, the National Assembly is mostly filled with moderates. So now there's going to be this uproar in the midst of France. So this is like New York City now. They bring the king back, he's safe, or they bring the president back. Everything seems fine, but there's a division right now. There's these extremists in the streets, and then there's these moderates that really, from the beginning, only wanted a constitutional monarchy. Lafayette will be one of them. So the last slide we left off with the National Assembly in the tennis court, pledging the tennis court oath that they were going to write a constitution and they were not going to leave until a constitution was written. So they wanted a written set of laws limiting the power of the king and demanding their constitutional rights. Now, in this period of time, rumors are spreading as Louis brings in troops to Versailles outside of Paris, and there were just rumors that these troops were going to storm Paris, that they were going to storm the National Assembly, and there was going to be a military coup. There was all other types of rumors that were spreading. 7 days later, he approves the vote by head count, right? By person, not by estate. But it was too late. All right. The working people of Paris. All right. Now, these are not necessarily the middle class. These are the shoemakers and artisans. They begin to organize. All right. That's what's called the sans culotte. Now, in my picture, I have me sans iPhone. All right. Without iPhone, I am not part of the elite student people who believe that having an Android makes you a lesser person than having an iPhone. So, as rumors are circulating, there was rumors also circulating that the National Assembly, all right, the old Third Estate and some nobles and some priests were locked in the dungeons of the Bastille. Now, let me give a little bit of background about the Bastille. The Bastille had been a fortress, all right, at one point. It was transformed into a prison in the 14th century. Now, it became just a symbol of unjust actions of the king. Now, people who it had this like mystery surrounding it. People who were put in the Bastille entered in carriages with drawn curtains, so you didn't know who that they are, with guards facing the other way. There was this whole mysterious aspect to it. Jailers are allegedly forbidden even to speak with the inmates. All right, Voltaire had spent time there twice. All right, then there's that famous story of the man in the iron mask, which story may sound familiar to you. Was supposedly an illegitimate brother and rival to Louis XIV, who was locked in the prison until he became a skeleton and inside an iron mask. In fact, though, at this period of history, these dungeons were hardly ever used, and the people in these prisons, I think there was like 7 people in there or something like that, actually were probably eating better than the people who were starving outside of Paris. So the question became, what would the king do? Now, if you remember, in 1788, they had a bad harvest. So in Paris, there's a revolutionary mood in the streets. Now, Paris was the center of this Enlightenment, so this had the fire underneath it. And rumors were circulating that nobles were hoarding grain. Now, Necker, the finance minister, was seen as the only hope. And this is the guy who lied on the books and, kept taxes low because he was just taking out more loans, which was not good financial policy anyway. Louis XVI, not really understanding the people, fires him. And this leads to the call to arms. All right. I call on my brothers to seek liberty was the call. So what did the people do? They storm monasteries for bread. All right, remember, it's this anti-Catholic idea, especially in the cities. Then they're going to storm the prisons for guns and cannons. and they start to free the inmates. Now imagine this. This is like New York City going wild, and people breaking into prisons and food stores, right? This is like riots of people going against the financial aspects of the city. So just think like New York City, all right? They claim all these buildings adjacent from the Bastille, which was well defended. It had 32 soldiers in it, I think. But these soldiers, they sympathize with the rioters. So outside, they're creating these smoke screens on adjacent buildings and lighting up hay. They start climbing local nearby buildings and shops that are adjacent to the Bastille. And on July 14th, 1789, Bastille Day, they storm the Bastille looking for arms. All right, they storm the prison, release 7 prisoners. I was right, and they take the Bastille. This becomes the beginning of the revolution, and this is why it's celebrated in France today as their Independence Day. And a symbol of this that's going to come up a little bit later is the tricolored flag that you guys are probably aware of. It. I should have a picture of it in here somewhere. And this is going to begin a pattern in France of, in Paris, people pushing for rebellion and revolution. All right. They call up the local militias in Paris as they seize control. And this is the National Guard. And they form a new city government called the Commune. They choose a mayor, and they anoint Lafayette, if you remember him from the American Revolution, as the leader of the citizen militia. And they begin to dismantle. So within Paris, they have that's like New York. People take control of New York and run New York for New Yorkers. So the king is still the king of France, but after the storming of the Bastille, Paris was not within the king's control anymore. The people had taken control of the city. So again, we're going to ask the question of like, what is the king going to do? And we will see in the future.